The Rockefeller Foundation has a rich history, whether it's in the number of friends that have been your fellows, got the opportunity to be experts in one field of knowledge or the other, or it's in terms of your intervention in the health programs that you've done, or it is the flagship International Institute for Agriculture, the IITA, in Ibadan, Nigeria, something that I know very well because it used to be one of the places you visited as a young child growing up to see agriculture at its agricultural research at its best. Your many other activities culminating in the work on Agra stands the test of time by virtue of the fact that at the time I went to the World Bank, my institution, my then institution, was being dropped for some of the challenges that had happened in African agriculture. And agriculture had not been at the center of the activities for a while. President Zolik and myself were very determined to bring agriculture back center stage, and we reasonably succeeded. The reason that I say we reasonably succeeded is that 5 years after, as I began to plan my exit from the bank, the same Commissioner for Agriculture at the African Union, who had not wasted her words at all in letting me know that our institution's record on agriculture was paltry, gave the best accolades to the work that we had done in trying to move the agenda on agriculture. And so when I look at what has happened through AGRA as an intervention as an idea that the Rockefeller Foundation has been very instrumental to, I have to say that I really applaud you. And Judith, you came in at the right time. I do want to say that what stands out in all that you said here is really the importance of people being the center of everything we say about development. Sometimes we forget. There are times when we gather and we talk about the processes and the systems, and then we forget that the ultimate issue is really about the people. It's about the impact that we're supposed to have on them. And so many times you came back to the issue of the person. And I think that that's what Rockefeller has been able to do. Rockefeller can point to certain individuals that are direct beneficiaries of the activities that you've embarked on. Even though you pay a lot of attention to academic research and the innovation, you ultimately know that until you can trace it to the change in the opportunities available to the individual, you really haven't done much. And so I applaud the Rockefeller Foundation. I know that many of you that are here today are people who follow Africa very well. And so I know that you are very well enlightened on the turnaround story of growth on the continent. And that is why when I saw the topic that you asked me to speak on, I said, very well put. Because this was a topic that got a lot of my attention during my vice presidency of the Africa region at the World Bank. Africa was already growing. And by virtue of the record that we had, Africa was growing for the first time at levels that it had not grown in the past. And it was growing on a consistent basis over a period of a decade. And that growth story was a good story, and it needed to be told. And I certainly was a very, very vocal voice in telling the story of that growth using the platform that I had. But there was something else that I wanted to put on the table, which is that growth in of itself, whether taken literally or technically, is a good thing. However, there are limits to growth. And that's where the curiosity as to what is it that growth delivers to the larger majority of the people. What is the nature of growth that we should be interested in? What kind of structure, what kind of quality of growth gives us the kind of critical impact in the lives of citizens that we seek to improve opportunities for? And that caught a lot of my attention, so I had to mobilize quite a number of my teams to investigate the idea of growth. And you know that one interesting thing about economists is that they are not the most gifted with the virtue of humility. And so sometimes it was a difficult process, getting into the kind of conversation that said the model that we look at for the basis of growth may undo itself by not delivering beyond what we have so far seen. So Africa was growing at an average of 5.4%, 5.5% over that period. But not commensurate impact was being seen in terms of the benefit of growth to the larger population. In fact, as the lead person in the region at that time, I would visit countries, and when I would go to countries, I would interact very much with the women, and I would, interact with the young, and I would go to the rural communities, and I would do the dancing with them, and do the eating with them. And one interesting thing that I always took away was when the young person sitting with me would say, Madam Vice President, I heard you when you said that Africa is growing, but I don't see it in my pocket. And that's, as anecdotal as it sounds, that really is the policymaker's nightmare. How do you make growth relevant to that young person who says to me, I hear your message, and of course I see the data behind what you say, but in terms of that message being symbolized by my own access to opportunities, there's still a gap. And so it is that I say must underpin the next 100 years of the thinking that you have. Because, by the way, one thing we know is that growth being good means that at least Africa has broken loose from that period in history in the 80s and the 90s when it was considered a basket case. And I think my dear friend Jonathan of The Economist is here. They made the mistake of calling Africa a hopeless continent. I don't know what made you do that. but you did it. And we accept your mea culpa that came a decade after, because there is no way you can give up on a huge population of people. The inexhaustible capacity of the human being to reinvent and to redeem themselves just beyond amazement. And so that's what we're going to see in the next 100 years that we talk about. So Africa went from being a continent that grew in the reverse to, in other words, negative real growth that we saw in the 80s and the 90s, to being one that began to just grow slowly, and then to being one that upped the game and went above 3% and consistently on a 5.4%, 5.5%. And then comes the global crisis. And that growth dips. And when that growth was dipping, during 2008, 2009, when the crisis was at its height, and the growth dipped by 2009 to about 1.9%, and I saw a lot of people holding their breath and saying, oh, other continents might just rebound and Africa would sleep. But it was interesting to see that by 2010, Africa did a quick rebound from 1.7%, 1.9% that growth went down to, and it rebounded to 3.8%. And subsequently, 2011, 4.3%. So the quickest recovery ever after a crisis by Africa. That is notable. It is notable in the sense that it shows that certain critical conditions have become commonplace enough that Africa did not depart from the path of fiscal rectitude and good macroeconomic management that enabled it to sustain the growth over the previous decade. And so it was important that beyond the conversation on what commodity boom had done for the continent during the period, that people needed to understand that at least 2/3 of the growth has been contributed to by just sensible policies, good policies. So what essentially this is all about is about a continent that understands that it does not have the privilege of some exceptionalism that says to it, the rest of the world can appreciate some economic fundamentals and you can just find your own differently from it. No, economic fundamentals are economic fundamentals. And so once the continent understood that, in terms of ensuring macroeconomic stability, which is a prerequisite condition for growth, it mastered the art of growing. Now, the subject matter of today is, since growth is necessary, but not a sufficient condition for poverty reduction, what must we then do? How must we then think innovatively in order to ensure that a larger population of people would share the benefits of growth? That a larger population of people would feel the sense of inclusion in the process of generating growth and benefiting from growth. One thing that I know is that when we look at a country like China, I mean, that's an amazing miracle of how within a period of 3 decades of constant focus on basic principles of market, of economic opportunities being distributed and accessed by a larger number, you could lift some 300 million people out of poverty, moving on to 400, moving on to 500. That's just revolutionary. So what it means is that it can be done. that answers the question. And I think that one of the things about the next 100 years, Judith, for a foundation like Rockefeller is to find the fastest way to repeat things that we know can be done. What's the fastest way? I loved the note of urgency in your mind. When I was at the bank, I said to we had a whole retreat that focused on not the urgency of now, but the urgency of how. How? How must we do it now? Because the poor have waited for too long. And too many seminars would not bring the food home. So, one of the things that one of the last couple of things that we did was the focus on the new Africa strategy of the bank. And when I looked at the two critical pillars that you shared, I thought to myself, whoa, this could have been twin documents, because, we basically said, what are the important next set of agenda for the continent? One thing we knew was that one would be structural change of the economies in order to enable private sector-led growth that creates jobs. One of the things in our strategy that I led was basically to put an emphasis on the role of the bank as not being number one, financier. No, number one role had to be partnerships, building partnerships, building the kinds of networks, because the solutions to the problems of the world do not lie or reside only within the vault of the World Bank. No. If there was a time it thought that way, it cannot think that way today. So we looked at partnerships as being the overriding asset, and the convening power of the World Bank is humongous. And so it needed to deploy it to optimal use by building partnerships internally and building partnerships externally. And so the first partnership for us became the citizens of the continent. In fact, when people applaud the strategy, I say to them, no, really, the people you should applaud are the everyday Africans with whom we sat through having the conversation before we started writing the strategy. The process of the strategy took a totally different approach. We wanted them to set the agenda and to tell us the story of poverty and what they felt were the key constraints to their own growth. So we saw partnership in demonstration, partnership with the citizens, partnership with the civil society, properly so-called, partnership with the private sector, domestic and external, partnership with the government, and then partnership with the other development partners, partnership with global private sector, partnership with all kinds of organizations with ideas or with any power of intervention. Just that process of agglomeration could make a difference in impact. So that was key. Then our second thing was not finance. We made our second most important asset knowledge. And that's where you come in again. Because the kind of investment in knowledge that you do in trying to understand solutions. And when you were saying that, I chuckled. The reason I chuckled was that I had a professor of public policy in those days at the Kennedy School, and he said to me, Obi, in Washington, we have people who have all the solutions they've been working on for so many years, and they just sit and wait for the election year. And then when somebody gets elected and the person makes a particular statement, off they go and they say, for that problem you talked about, I have the solution. So they have solution waiting for the problem to be identified. And it's not a bad thing because it's an investment in knowledge. Knowledge is so key. One of the things I found out in interacting with various country leaderships, and that's what also has been my area of greatest interest. What I found is that sometimes people assume that the inefficiency and ineffectiveness of the development process on the continent is only because of poor governance. And I say big mistake. Poor governance is a major part of it. But even quite acute and critical is the issue of the knowledge gap in terms of the solutions and how they are gathered within the government. Within the government. Once upon a time, many of the countries you see today in Africa had public sectors that attracted the best of the citizens. The most well-trained of citizens went to the public sector. They didn't go to the private sector. They voted for the public sector. And then something went wrong in the governance of a number of these countries. And what do you think happened? They voted with their feet. The best decided the public sector is not where I'm going to go. They went elsewhere. And so what you have is a dearth of capacity in the public sector. Capacity to make sound policies, to embark on the kind of policy research, and then capacity to really understand the problems and use the research findings as a basis to formulate policies, and then capacity to move from formulated policies to execution for results. For results. Much of governance can happen without an emphasis on understanding whether results were accomplished. So when you talked about the dictator you have in-house on measurement, I was thinking to myself, that should be part of your next 100 years. The fact that you want to deploy similar discipline to your partners outside of Rockefeller in order to develop again and build back again the culture of results. There is need that when an objective is set, we should go back to identifying whether we accomplished, or if we did not, what did we learn in the process of investment into that problem. Now, the key one for me in our strategy, and there I want to spend a little more time, is the issue of governance. Governance. One of the things we identified through research is that whether it was an agriculture problem, or it was an energy deficit problem, or it was a transportation problem, as we burrowed into it through study, through research, it ultimately ended up being a governance problem. So, for example, in a sector like education, you look at the failure rate of children in school, and you immediately begin to think of many things that could be the cause of it. And then you ended up with the issue of the quality of the teachers. And you're talking about the quality of the teachers, and suddenly you also see that even when the teachers are qualified, that in a place like Tanzania, maybe some 80% of the times, the place you would find them is not the classroom. That's a governance failure, isn't it? It is. So you're paying for teachers to teach, but they're actually not there teaching. Or it's in the transportation sector, and you look at the fact that transportation is important for those in the informal sector whose productivity you're trying to enhance. And then you look at it closely, and then you find out that the reason that transportation services is not available effectively and efficiently for the poor is because the truckers have managed to build themselves into a huge elite that is politically well connected and therefore has cornered the market and made it difficult for there to be the kind of reform in transportation pricing and regulation to enable competition. So they shut out entry into the sector. Therefore, transportation services become difficult for the poor. What is that again? It's a governance problem. You look at the energy sector, which is a sector that holds back the huge growth that is still stranded on the continent. It's a sector where only 1 out of every 4 has got access to electricity. And you know, electricity, just taking it to the level of Mauritius in terms of infrastructure development, can add a 40% jump on productivity for the continent. It can increase the growth rate by at least an additional 2%. Now that's significant. But then look at the energy sector. And you find that the failing sector is as a result of governance issues in the management of the electricity, of the power sector. The institutions and the inefficiencies and the procurement systems and the determination to keep the public money within the sector, because it offers elite the opportunity for the kind of bad behavior that goes unpunished and therefore incentivizes even more bad behavior. What is that again? It's a governance issue. So what then to do with this big elephant called governance and poor governance? When you look at the big picture of where Africa is today and the kind of growth that it must generate in order to significantly reduce the still high 48% poor on the continent, it must be completely a radical sea change from the steady state status quo approach. What it therefore means is that, as you said, Judith, we cannot emphasize sectoral input. We need to look at development from a systemic and integrated perspective. So it means that multi-sectoral solutions will have to be the heart of the next 100 years. The multi-sectoral solutions must mean that we identify and ask the right sets of questions. Is the Rockefeller Foundation in a position to begin to look at policy, good policies? Because macroeconomic stability type policies are easier to embark upon. The vested interests cannot capture those in the way that they can easily capture structural and sectoral policy changes. What it then means is that the incentive to move the agenda forward for sectoral and structural policy change is lower than the threshold that you need for the kind of revolution we want to see in agriculture, in energy, in transportation, in education. To that extent, therefore, groups like the Rockefeller Foundation can begin to look at those microeconomic level type structural sectoral policy issues and to see in how it can partner to provide the right agglomeration of policy skilled persons to support the thinking that must go into this next decade for the continent. If the continent stays at the level of achieving macroeconomic stability and the growth that it has generated, there is nothing new that will happen. The new tranche and cycle of growth will come from this diversification strategy that would look at structural change. And that is only possible through the right kinds of expertise in the right number within the sectors of governance. So that's one. The second thing would be for a number of the countries that are resource rich, we know that they can do better with their resources than even the money the foundation can give to them. So how do we use the resources of the foundation and other partners as a leverage for maximizing outcome and impact? How do we focus on this issue of better governance of nationally mobilized resources? That takes us back again to building the right systems, the right institutions, but then, of course, giving a place for the voice of the citizens to monitor, to follow results, and to demand for accountability when the results don't match corresponding resources that have been invested into generating them. On the competitiveness and employment issues, I would ask the question on, is there something we miss in not embracing new possibilities on economic paradigms of how we can bridge the gulf that exists between the 1% that is doing well in the world and the rest 99%? Are we captives of the mental mode that tells us that the capitalism that we've seen so far has generated the best prosperity in the history of mankind? While it has done so, we have also seen the downside risks. So what new kind of development economic thinking can we use this platform to convey? What is it that replaces the then Washington consensus? Are there issues that are relevant to thinking of market failure, government failure, and seeing how you strike the balance toward generating the appropriate set of collaborative partnerships between the private sector, the government, and the citizens toward growth that is more inclusive? That's another set of thinking that should concern us. On the vulnerability and resilience to external shocks, as countries begin to build in mechanisms to respond to shocks, especially to protect the poor and to sustain economic growth, how do we ensure that this doesn't lend itself to political capture? Because it could. It could lend itself to political capture that keeps people in a place of low-level equilibrium, which you don't need. Because we know that at a particular threshold of embracing economic opportunities, you enhance the voice of citizens. You don't want to keep people to the lowliest minimum. How do we strengthen institutions? How do we help prepare the adaptation process to the climatic variabilities? This is an important aspect of Africa's own development trajectory. The truth is that Africa may not have contributed at less than 2% to global warming. But the impact of global warming, nonetheless, is already with Africa. So, how then can that be contained without compromising Africa's own economic development? Those are the kinds of things we should focus on. For the fragile states, for the fragile countries, what are we learning? What have we learned in terms of how you build back from a failed state to a state with the right set of institutions, with the capacity for policy making, and with the kind of resources adequate for investment? Because you must have policy, you must have institutions, and you must have investment in the critical order for a state to be built back into an agency for the improvement of the quality of life of citizens. What have we learned? How can we deploy this? And then, finally, the regional solutions. You know, Judith, that's where Africa's future lies. Africa cannot be optimal in its fast pace toward climbing the economic ladder if it stays with the 50 plus countries depending on who you count, and does everything at that unit level. Regional solutions are key. Whether they are for public goods in the form of health interventions or education, or in terms of hard goods in the form of infrastructure, whether the rail systems, whether it's the water systems and how to manage them, whether it's, the energy power pools, the regional solutions are key. And for some of your grantees, they now need to begin to look at their results as having regional implications, not just community-based solutions. So that regionalism as a part of the process of making an impact is going to be key. Let me say to you that I believe very much that this next decade is going to be Africa's opportunity to prove that whereas shifts are happening in jurisdictions that were important for Africa, Africa's more than survived those shifts. And that it not only survived the shifts, but that it learned by virtue of its successes, particularly the one that is so clear in the minds of the youthful population that does not carry the albatross of failure. They don't. The youthful population in Africa today had no idea of colonialism. It's story to them. They didn't know military rule. It's strange to them. They are intolerant of poor performance. They don't understand why. That should be their lot. So it's a totally different set of people that is emerging into reckoning on the continent at a time when information is at its cheapest. Now, what does that say for innovation? It says a lot. No wonder the country we're in is the leading country as far as using the telephone as a system of financial services could happen. That's the new Africa. And that's the Africa that I am walking into as a friend of Rockefeller Foundation.